Now, circling back to China's economy and its latest manufacturing data, let's bring in Dan McClory. Dan is the Managing Director and Head of China for Bousted Securities. Good to see you again.
Thanks, Rochelle.
So first off, I want to start by taking a look at Vice Premier Liu He, who said that economic growth is expected to exceed expectations this year. What are your thoughts on his prediction?
Well, I would say it's predictable. So he has referenced the 6% figure, which most global analysts had already pegged, earlier in the year. So I think there's great consistency with that. And he's supporting that despite headwinds that might be coming from other areas and maybe some negativity on the Chinese economy, that we're going to see that 6%.
So as you say, this is in line with what economists are forecasting. Talk about some of the factors that are really driving these predictions.
Well, we've seen a robust recovery to start the year in China from, the COVID pandemic. Just massive high growth rates, which have subsided and have trended downwards. So the overall average is going to end up at 6%. But make no mistake, there was much higher growth rates that were taking place at the beginning of the year because of recovering from a very difficult pandemic period to where they are now.
So then how does China's growth compare with other major economies?
Well, China's growth is seen now to be somewhat less predictable, despite what the Vice Premier said today, because of the possibility of another outbreak of COVID, the continued travel restrictions, and perhaps some of the isolation from the global supply chain as a result of those. It's affected manufacturing. So other countries that have dealt with COVID in different ways and perhaps incurred greater loss of life, greater infection rates, have somewhat taken this herd immunity stance, and they are seen as being perhaps more predictable. But there are some unknowns about China related to its very firm zero COVID policy.
Now, I also want to look at some other highlights from Liu He's speech, and especially his comments coming as we see this first economic data coming out for November. Talk about the key takeaways from his speech and how that perhaps matches up with the latest PMI data.
Well, I would say, again, the headline statement is, make no mistake, you're going to see that 6% growth. I think that's the most confident, strongest, and direct signal that came out of it. In terms of PMI data, there's some mixed reports. Kaishan came out with some data that said the manufacturing index in November had in fact weakened, and that perhaps there was some lesser level of employment than previously thought. So I think the Vice Premier's comments ride on top of all of that and give a very clear message of where things are going to end up. But I still think there is some discussion going on about the components that make up that type of GDP growth for the year. I don't think there's a general consensus either about data from third parties or data from China that's completely supportive of that narrative. I think, as is often the case, economists and analysts are going to debate things.
And obviously, in the age of COVID, a lot of things changing quickly. How do Omicron concerns factor into what may happen with economic growth going forward?
See, this is where I think China's zero COVID policy has already kind of priced that into the results. I think the rest of the world, which took perhaps a more open-ended approach to dealing with COVID, now it's considering, harsh lockdowns, travel cutoffs, inbound testing requirements. So now I think the rest of the global economy is looking at itself and saying, oh my gosh, is there another shoe that's about to drop here? Is there another factor that isn't already priced in because this was somewhat unforeseen and we dealt with COVID in a different manner that could have a negative effect? With China, that's already priced in because China decided to take a very firm lockdown approach.
So then outside of that, then what are some of the other challenges to growth that you're going to be keeping an eye on as this year comes to a close?
Clearly, Rochelle, it is hopefully as soon as possible a return to a more normalized global supply chain. And I'm talking about the free flow of goods and shipping lanes and ports. This has really hindered a lot of the world. So that's a very important underlying theme that everyone is looking at. When are we going to return to any form of normalcy. That's number one. Number two is, consumer spending. Is there going to be robust consumer spending? Is that going to continue?
Right.
Is inflation going to discourage that or render it less viable because the same amount of money can buy less? Those are a couple of really important, and then a return to some greater form of employment everywhere in the world. Are we going to see that continue to tick up?
All right. Well, thank you as always. Dan McClory there, Managing Director and Head of China for Boustead Securities.